which make the most reasonable explanation for their existence that some sort of intelligent agent acted during biological history. Alternative explanations, in terms of chance or multiple universes or some as yet unknown natural law, are possible but far less plausible. There's a philosophy of science claim. A scientific investigation of the world need not always limit itself to naturalistic mechanisms under certain particular circumstances, and when studying particular events, an explanation in terms of actions by intelligent agents could be acceptable and useful in scientific progress. You can make analogies, for example, to forensic science. There's often a religious claim for most ID advocates. God acted miraculously in biological history to create first life and cause some increases in biological complexity. There's often a theological claim that there are theological reasons for expecting that God acted miraculously in biological history, and an apologetic claim that intelligent design is a good approach for combating atheism in the culture. Now, some people challenge the theological claim of intelligent design on theological grounds, and some people challenge the scientific claim of ID on scientific grounds, and I think that's extremely legitimate, and ID advocates should welcome such critiques as ways to sharpen their thinking. But in my experience, those are not the most common criticisms of ID. The most common criticisms are what I call the four myths. Now, laying out these different claims the way I did gives you an outline of my thinking here. ID is not just creationism in disguise, because the first three claims on the handout really can be evaluated apart from the three religious claims. ID is partly scientific because the scientific claim can and ought to be thoroughly investigated by the methods of science. A very large fraction of the criticisms of ID are aimed at those philosophical claims, the philosophical and philosophy of science. Now, I happen to believe that those claims are highly defensible and probably true, at least when phrased in certain ways, even though I happen to believe that the scientific claim is probably false. So, in my full paper, and the URL for that is at the top of your handout, I argue at some length why I believe these four myths about ID are unfair when applied to ID as a whole. So now let's think about theistic evolution, and if you're wondering how I'm going to define it, it's pretty much what you saw for definition 2 of that you had up there, that God was active. I'll say a little bit more about that, but not in a scientifically detectable way. Another way to define this would be theistic evolution refers to and this is going to narrow it down from all versions of theistic evolution out there. This is what I'm going to talk about that I happen to hold within this range, and I know plenty of other theistic evolutionists who do. A set of beliefs and arguments that God chose to govern pre-human biological history through ordinary natural processes without using scientifically detectable miracles. Now, note the restriction to biological history. I'm not talking about theories of cosmological evolution or human social evolution. And note the words God chose. Now, some advocates of deism or process theology or panentheism or liberal theology might call themselves theistic evolutionists and say God had no choice but to act non-miraculously. And I'm not discussing those versions of theistic evolution. I'm discussing a version of theistic evolution held by many Christians with more orthodox views on God's sovereignty and governance, in which God was fully capable of performing scientifically detectable miracles or scientifically detectable guidance during pre-human biological history, but chose not to do so. Note also the restriction to pre-human history. Theistic evolution advocates who take a more orthodox view of God's sovereignty typically say that God did act miraculously in revelatory ways in human history. I know a lot of people who prefer the term evolutionary creation for this view. I do too, but since theistic evolution is a more common term, I'll just use that. All right, so where was my point? Okay, so again, I'll start like I did with ID. In recent years, certain criticisms of theistic evolution are frequently repeated in books and articles and blogs and email lists, and I believe these criticisms are unfair because they oversimplify theistic evolution, and they're overgeneralized to apply to all theistic evolution advocates. I call them myths. Myth number 1, theistic evolutionists don't confront atheism. Myth number 2, theistic evolutionists embrace methodological naturalism in science because they don't believe in miracles or are embarrassed by them. 3, theistic evolution is essentially deism. It doesn't have God acting as creator in any meaningful sense. Myth 4, theistic evolutionists support evolution because they're worried about their jobs or their scientific respectability. These myths are common because at least 3 of them are true about some theistic evolutionist writings and some theistic evolution advocates some of the time. But they're not intrinsically or necessarily true about theistic evolution. And I'm going to again be bold and say it's false, literally bearing false witness, to say or imply that they are true about all theistic evolution views and advocates. So myth number 1. Theistic evolutionists don't confront atheism. Now, some theistic evolution advocates concentrate on arguing for the scientific theory of evolution against young earth creationism or ID to Christian audiences. And in such groups, particularly blogs and email lists and discussion groups, theistic evolution advocates sometimes neglect explaining how their views differ from atheistic or deistic evolution. And if this is the only way that someone encounters theistic evolution arguments, this misconception is understandable. However, a simple review of articles and books written by theistic evolution advocates refute this myth. I haven't done a broad survey, but the vast majority of theistic articles I've read, and every single theistic evolution book I've read, including some Ken Miller's books and many other books aimed at broad Christian audience, spend considerable time confronting atheism and distinguishing themselves from atheism and deism. Many theistic evolutionist advocates also give public lectures in which confronting atheism is a central point. Now, in light of all those articles and books and lectures, why does this criticism of theistic evolution keep resurfacing? I guess in some cases, critics may not have actually read the theistic evolution articles and books. They're relying on speculation or hearsay or encounters with theistic evolution advocates in online discussion groups where they get into arguments. In other cases, and this is the one that really worries me, perhaps these critics have read theistic evolution articles and books and they simply don't recognize or remember there was this attack on atheism because it doesn't take the form they expect, namely as an attack on the theory of evolution. Now, whatever the source, in either case, it's important that critics who make this charge that theistic evolutionists don't confront atheism just become better informed about what theistic evolution advocates are actually doing. All right, myth number 2. Theistic evolutionists embrace methodological naturalism science because they don't believe in miracles or are embarrassed by miracles. Now, I can understand the concern here. Liberal theology, process theology, there is a de-emphasis or outright rejection of miracles. However, many advocates of theistic evolution reject liberal theology or process theology. They have no trouble with miracles. Theistic evolution does not require a general rejection of miracles. Theistic evolution requires a much more limited claim that methodological naturalism is a good working strategy for the remaining scientific mysteries of pre-human biological history. That's really all that's required, including how first life and later developments of complexity might have come about. It's a good working strategy for the remaining mysteries of pre-human biological history. Now, advocates of theistic evolution would pretty much agree that methodological naturalism is a good working strategy for this limited area. But they don't all agree about why. And this is a source of some confusion, but it's one we have to live with. I have heard various advocates of theistic evolution suggest each of the following 7 reasons, and I believe most theistic evolution advocates might agree with 1 or 2 and disagree with the rest. So let me lay them on you here. 7 different options for accepting methodological naturalism as a good working strategy for biological history. Option 1 might be, I expect methodological naturalism will always work in the natural sciences because I believe primarily for theological reasons, informed by science, that God chose to work in creation only in hidden ways except for a few instances of heaven breaking into creation like the incarnation and resurrection. Option 2 that I've heard. I expect methodological naturalism will always work for studying pre-human natural history because I believe, for a combination of scientific and theological reasons, that God chose to govern natural history through natural processes. God chose to reserve special miracles for human history. While God could do miracles at any time, God chose to do miracles in limited contexts and particular occasions during human history connected to special revelation to human beings. Option 3 I've heard. Methodological naturalism might not succeed in explaining everything about the natural world, but there's a practical reason, rather than a principial reason, for keeping methodological naturalism as a rule for science. Science has made progress over the past centuries